Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our Google Hangout. This is the first thing that we're doing to start gearing up for Spring Lobby Weekend. With us tonight, we have Kara Gotsch, who is the Director of Advocacy for the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition. That is a large organization that works in coalition with 40 other faith organizations. She's doing a lot of work around the issue of mass incarceration. She's worked a lot on the death penalty abolition, criminal justice reform. She's advocated for prisoner rights and sentencing reform, and also worked on reentry issues. Kara has been working alongside FCNL on our work for mass incarceration issues, and so we have a pretty good partnership with her, and so we're really thankful that she's here with us today, or I guess I should say tonight. And so Kara's gonna walk you through basically the basics of what is going on with criminal justice reform. She's going to talk about the issue of mass incarceration generally, so that you can get a basic understanding about what that issue is, how it affects you, and why FCNL is concerned about it. And why FCNL is concerned about it is because we believe in equity and justice for all people. And so this is an issue that's really near and dear to people within FCNL's network's heart. And it's an issue that we care deeply about, that we are working on diligently. And so the first half of this call will be Kara talking about the issue, and then we'll take some questions, and hopefully we'll get some answers. And then the second half of the call, Kara will leave, and I will be talking more specifically about Spring Lobby Weekend, about how to recruit on your campus for Spring Lobby Weekend, logistics of how to get here, and dates and everything like that. So now I will take this over to Kara, and Kara will brief you on the issue of mass incarceration. Kara?
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be here. I really have enjoyed working with the Friends Committee for the last about 2 years on addressing federal criminal justice changes. I wanted to start out just by giving you a sense of sort of the overall issue. You know, a lot of the work that FCNL in Washington and I do is focus on the federal criminal justice system, the Federal Bureau. Mass incarceration is a much larger issue. It touches states all over the country. It touches counties and cities. And so wherever you live in the country, there is a prison or a jail, and something, opportunity for you to get engaged in this issue. So what are the basics? So 2.2 million people are incarcerated in the United States. We have the largest incarceration in the world. Our country is the largest incarcerator in the world. About 25% of the world's prisoners live in the United States. That's not just per capita, but sheer number. So the United States is quite unique in its reliance on incarceration as a form of punishment. Among those who are incarcerated, about 60% are people of color, African American and Latino, and about 92% are men. It is very much a predominantly men who are incarcerated in the United States, although women are growing at faster rates than males' incarceration. So when I think about why do we care that there's 2.2 million people in prison? Why is that something that we should be concerned about? Because that has an impact on all of us. Whether you know someone who's incarcerated or not. We all, first of all, from my perspective, should be concerned about our fellow man and our fellow women who have been entangled in the criminal justice system. There is significant racial disparity in our criminal justice system. There is a disproportionate number of people who and many of us would probably not consider threats to public safety. And incarceration has been over-relied upon. When people in my perspective can be better served serving punishments that don't take them into a prison or a jail. You're taking someone out of their family, out of their community, has significant impacts on their children, on their likelihood of being able to maintain employment, to earn an education. It can be incredibly debilitating. So mass incarceration has also exploded. This was for the first part of the 20th century. We were pretty level in the numbers of people we incarcerated. In the mid to late 70s, that trajectory changed, and we started substantially raising the number of people who are incarcerated. Now, in the last 3 years, we've started to see a small tick down, but largely it remains flat right over 2 million people. I'm encouraged by those couple years of where we've seen a decrease, and I think that marks a real opportunity for all of us to continue to put pressure on the need for policy changes, and to rethink sort of the strategies that have brought us here around issues of racial disparity and why mass incarceration is problematic. Statistics like 1 in 3 African American boys born today, if our current rates of incarceration continue, will find themselves incarcerated at some point in their life. 1 in 6 Hispanic boys will find themselves incarcerated. That compares to about 1 in 17 Caucasian males will find themselves incarcerated at some point in their life. Those are shocking and deeply disturbing statistics, and obviously anyone who cares about sort of the impact the lives of anyone, and the considers the debilitating impact of incarceration should be concerned about those numbers. So, like I said, in the last couple of years, we've seen a beginning of a decrease in in the number of people who are going to prison. That has largely been led by state Department of Corrections, state policymakers trying to address the overcrowding and high cost of incarceration. For most states, the Department of Corrections is the primary budget item in their state budgets, and in putting more and more people in prison is very expensive. So we've seen some scale backs of mandatory minimum sentencing for low-level drug offenses. We've seen reform of the juvenile justice system. Actually, the incarcerated population for juveniles has been cut in half over the last 10 years, which is a major success, and something, an example that we really should follow at the adult level. More emphasis on placing youth outside of an incarcerated setting to address their delinquency. So at the federal level, the Bureau of Prisons has increased, their population has increased about 800% since 1980. Half of those who are in the Federal Bureau of Prisons are there for drug offenses, and the vast majority of those people are low level. What's unique about the federal system is particularly harsh sentences for drug offenses. You see mandatory minimums at the state level as well, but at the federal level, they're particularly harsh. And that's why you see such a high proportion of the federal prison population who are incarcerated in the federal system, making up such a large proportion. So with FCNL and the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition and the United Methodist Church, who I work with, and our many interfaith partners, we've been working to change the sentencing laws at the federal level. Over the years, there has been some progress. They narrowed the 100-to-1 crack cocaine sentencing disparity, which treated crack and powder cocaine and resulted in huge racial disparity in the system. About 80% of African Americans were serving time for crack cocaine. So in 2010, legislation was passed to reduce that disparity, reduce the number of people in federal prison for crack cocaine offenses. Today, we're hoping to apply the reductions in the mandatory minimums for all drugs, not just crack. And there's progress. We see both the Senate and the House have passed legislation, sentencing reform legislation, to provide more discretion for judges and how they choose to sentence defendants, particularly in drug cases. The Senate had legislation that passed out of its Judiciary Committee in October, and the House has recently passed in November sentencing reform legislation. So we're hoping in early 2016 to see reform move through the Congress, through the full House and Senate, and I'm optimistic because of the significant bipartisan support for that, we'll be able to get legislation enacted in 2016. And I think that's where your lobbying and your participation in FCNL's event this coming spring, or in March, actually very early in March, is really critical, because we're at such an important moment in history, certainly at the congressional level, around sentencing reform. The legislation would look at juveniles, how they're treated, would end juvenile life without parole. That's an important statement for the Congress to be making. It would end solitary confinement for juveniles, and it would end the three strikes provision for drug offenses, allowing people who have serving life without parole sentences for 3 drug crimes to have their sentence retroactively reduced to 25 years, which would be immense. It applies prospectively as well as retroactively. So a lot of good things, not as significant as we'd like to see, but it's definitely a step in the right direction, considering sort of the context that we're operating in. So, I mean, that's sort of a very quick sort of summary of what we're doing and why we're focusing on addressing mass incarceration. But if we want to ask some questions or move on, that'd be fine with me.
I think what we'll do is we will ask some questions. Let me see. I have some questions coming from Lydia Walcott from Wilmington College.
Great.
And she's asking, which laws are being changed to include longer sentences? Secondly, what is the rate of African Americans to whites in prison, which you answered that previously, 1 to 3 and 1 to 17. Is that correct?
Well, the 1 to 3 is just having to do with youth born today. So African American child born today, a boy born today, has a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated in his lifetime. Now, if you're interested in knowing sort of what the proportions are of the current incarcerated population, about 60% of those who are incarcerated are people of color. I think 40% is African American, and the remaining 40% are African American, 20% are Hispanic. The remaining 40% would be Caucasian.
Okay. I think that's what she was looking for then.
Yeah. And so the first question, let me go back to the first question having to do with sentencing increases. Does that relate to the new federal sentencing legislation that is on board, that's currently pending in Congress? Because there are some new sentencing enhancements. So in the Senate bill, the name of the legislation that I'm focusing on right now is called the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. It's S2123. There are 2 new mandatory minimums included in that legislation. One is a mandatory minimum for interstate domestic violence resulting in death, and which is a 10-year mandatory minimum. And the second new sentence is for weapons exports to people engaged in terrorist activity, and I believe that is a 5-year mandatory minimum. Under current law, there are very few people who are prosecuted under those laws. So although our organization opposes mandatory minimums, we don't like that there's increased penalties in the law. It would impact a small number of people, less than probably 60 people a year. So I think in our sort of decision-making process, trying to determine, how do we decide whether we support or oppose something or don't take a position, considering all the other provisions of the legislation and the overall positive impact that they would make, we sort of, take these new enhancements as sort of the price of politics, unfortunately, because it is hugely bipartisan legislation. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee is the lead sponsor, and those were 2 pieces that he insisted on. So in order to get him to come along on the reform end, he negotiated these tougher penalties into the legislation. On the House side, there is an enhancement in the sentencing reform. On the House side, interestingly enough, there is no new mandatory minimums in their sentencing proposal, but there is an enhancement included for fentanyl, which is a chemical that's often mixed with heroin to make it more potent, or sometimes it's sold as heroin, even though it's not technically heroin. So it would create an enhancement for, which is not mandatory, but would allow a judge to add an additional time on if the crime involved fentanyl.
An additional question to that is, how are the changes in these laws specifically affecting African Americans? Talking more about the racial disparities, how this current situation is much more pitted against the African American community than the white community.
Yeah, well, I mean, overall, yes. I mean, overall in the federal system, at the state level and the local level, African Americans in particular are certainly disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. Policing happens much more intensively in communities of color, in poorer communities, and so the arrests are higher, and throughout the entire system, you see African Americans sort of disproportionately impacted at arrest, at decisions of whether to prosecute, and at sentencing. That they are getting, they're more likely to get arrested for prosecutors to prosecute, and also to face incarceration at sentencing. So yes, there is a disproportionate impact. As far as the sentencing reforms that we're looking at, it is certainly our belief, and it is our objective that it will help to reduce the disparity within the federal prison system. A large proportion, a majority proportion of those serving mandatory minimums for drug offenses are African American and Latino, and certainly by reducing those penalties and by providing more discretion to judges to sentence below a mandatory minimum, we believe that it will have a positive impact on communities of color within the system. So, yeah, and that certainly is our objective.
Can you just kind of flesh out that idea a little bit about the fact that judges are losing their discretion under current laws, how judges are kind of pigeonholed into this mandatory minimum, and how the legislation that's coming through is trying to fix that, I guess.
Sure, of course. So mandatory minimums, well, at least at the federal level, which is similar to how they operate at the state level, provides very little discretion for judges to sentence individuals. So there's a sentencing grid, and in a case, a defendant is, they look at their criminal history, they look at the quantity of drugs they have, and then they sort of all lines up. They get a score, and then they line up the sentence with that. So a judge, legislators say the mandatory minimums are determined by legislators who have never met a defendant. They prescribe the mandatory minimum with the associated drug quantity, and if the defendant meets that threshold of drugs, then that's the corresponding mandatory minimum that they get. Now, obviously, if they also have a prior criminal record, that the mandatory minimums could increase correspondingly. So it doesn't allow things like the defendant's age or background or mental capacity to come into consideration. Those are not relevant. It simply has to do with their criminal record and the quantity of drugs. And so that's why they're particularly harsh, right? When people say, well, is it a good thing to give judges more discretion? Well, right now, all the discretion really lies with prosecutors. Prosecutors decide to charge a defendant, and based on that, that's what the corresponding mandatory minimum is. And so really the mandatory minimums gives more power to prosecutors, because it all depends on how they decide to charge someone. When you give more discretion to a judge, at the very least, they are supposed to be and usually do operate as a neutral party. They are neither with the prosecution or with the defense. They are the neutral party. And so taking away some of that power from prosecutors, in my mind, is a very good thing, and giving it to a judge who, under the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act and the House's Sentencing Reform Act, would be able to look at multiple factors. They'll really be able to consider the culpability of a defendant. What were they a leader in the offense? Did they operate a drug operation? Are they low leveled? Are they simply a street level dealer or a lookout? Or are they someone's girlfriend who just got caught up in an operation? Those are important factors to consider, and under the current sentencing structure, both at the state and federal level, those factors can't be considered by a judge. And so that's important. We want there to be more issues considered in the sentencing of defendants. And by getting rid of mandatory minimums, you can do that.
Great, thanks. I think that clears that up a lot.
Great.
So a question that I had is, what is the most effective argument that that you think, when it comes to talking to legislators, what's the most effective angle, I guess, to take when talking about this? Do they respond more so to the moral call, the fact that this is obviously has a racial injustice aspect to it, the issue of mass incarceration, or are they responding more to the financial arguments? We're spending how many billions of dollars a year on the criminal justice system, and it's a system that has a failing rate. It's not successful because the recidivism rate is really high, if I'm not mistaken. So what are the arguments that you have heard or that you use that seem to be effective?
Well, you have to tailor your arguments for the audience that you're talking to. And I think the popular wisdom is that conservative politicians or people who are fiscal conservatives, the financial arguments resonate most with them. I think that's true, that for some, that is an important argument. $80 billion a year spent in our correction system. At the federal level, it's about $7 billion a year just to the Bureau of Prisons. It's very expensive. I mean, at the federal level, the Bureau of Prisons is within the budget of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has a lot of responsibilities. That just doesn't mean prisons. They pay for victim services. They pay for cops on the beat out in cities and communities. They pay for a lot of different things. The FBI, it's a huge portfolio. But because prisons at the federal level keep getting more overcrowded and are very large, they can't cut they can't cut the budgets for the Federal Bureau of Prisons because they have to feed people and they have to house them. They don't provide them a whole lot of rehabilitative services, but they have to feed them and house them. So that budget every year gets bigger, but there isn't necessarily more money. So that means other programs, important programs that provide drug treatment, reentry services, victim services, those all are getting cut at the cost of building and housing more prisoners. And so that is an argument that does resonate well. From my perspective, though, as someone who works with the interfaith community, someone who is a person of faith myself, I do believe the moral arguments are most important, but I also do believe that they resonate with a large swath of politicians. There are many people who believe that we are all God's children, and we must have compassion for one another, regardless of sort of our path, regardless of what we may have done. We must have compassion for one another, and I and many people believe in redemption, and that providing rehabilitative services is critical to giving someone a second chance, and that just because someone's gone to prison doesn't mean that they should be forgotten or forsaken. That message resonates both with Democrats and Republicans, and it's one that I certainly prioritize when I talk to lawmakers and their staff about why these issues are so important. So there's a, and the racial disparity arguments are also critically important to make, because it's a matter of fairness and justice and what kind of system we want to live in.
Those are some really good points, Kara. So I think that that's all we have for questions that have been submitted. I will be following up with you if some other questions come up, but I think that unless you feel like there's something that we missed, then I'll just let you go, and we'll move on to the next half of the call, which is about focusing more specifically on Spring Lobby Weekend.
Great. I thank you so much for inviting me to participate. It's really a wonderful time for folks to be thinking about this issue of mass incarceration. Lawmakers, certainly in Congress, are very interested in a bipartisan way in sort of addressing this issue that has been ignored for far too long. So your participation in these issues is so important and so timely. So thank you so much for your interest in the topic.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Kara.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. So, Kara did an excellent job briefing you all on the issue. It's obviously a very weighty one, and one that has a lot of depth to it. But we have hope. And that's why we are focusing this year's Spring Lobby Weekend, which is March 12th through the 15th, on the issue of mass incarceration, because like Kara said, we believe that early 2016, spring of 2016, that there is a lot of opportunity for legislation to move on this issue and to be enacted. So that's why we really need your voices to work with us on this. So, like I said, Spring Lobby Weekend is in Washington, D.C., March 12th through the 15th. And it usually is falling on a lot of colleges' spring break trips. So keep that in mind for maybe an alternative spring break trip for you and your friends to go on. I'm going to give you, oops, lost my lights. Not moving around enough. Motion sensors. So I'm going to give you a breakdown of what the schedule looks like. So on Saturday, which is the first day of the program, there will be a welcome, and then we'll give you some background on the issue of mass incarceration, much like what Kara just did for us. And then we'll talk about what's happening with the legislation so far, where it's at, and where it needs to be. The next day, we will be doing some briefings on understanding U.S. incarceration policy. So give you some more in-depth knowledge about the legislation as it is so far, the current situation of mass incarceration in the United States, and why we see this as an issue. And then we will be moving on to finding opportunities in this Congress to act. So where are our opportunities to actually move this legislation forward? So that's Sunday. And then Monday will be another day of briefings. We will have a congressional staff panel, which is always really exciting. It's an off-the-record discussion with staffers that are working directly with the congressmen and women, and they will be telling us their personal opinions on how to craft your arguments, what to say when you're in their offices, what are the points that you need to be making when you're lobbying these members of Congress, what's most effective. So that's always really great. And then we will be moving on to how you can continue working on this issue when you go back in your communities. So lobbying in district, at home, and how you can get your community involved. So that means writing letters to the editor, which are really, really important and very effective, or writing op-ed pieces, which are things that you probably haven't done before. If you have, great. We can give you some even more tips on how to make those super effective. Because believe it or not, the legislators see those. And then Tuesday is the lobby day. So Tuesday you'll wake up bright and early and you'll put on your suit and tie or your power suit dress, and you will walk into the halls of Congress and you will lobby. And you will walk out of there feeling like $1,000,000 because you exercised your right as a citizen, and you will have made change. And so it doesn't end there. You'll get on your bus or your van or your train and you'll go home, and then you'll email that representative, following up with them, asking them where they're at on this issue, and you're going to start to form a relationship. So Spring Lobby Weekend is a lot of learning, a lot of taking in, but we hope that we are equipping you to go back to your communities and make some real change, and to engage your community in this issue of mass incarceration. So that's a brief what it'll look like. But I want to tell you a little bit about my story and why this event is such a big deal. When I went to college, I was super unengaged. My freshman year, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. And so I was looking for something to give me purpose, looking for something to get engaged with, because I was really disengaged. And a professor sought me out, my political science professor, and told me that I should come to Spring Lobby Weekend my freshman year. And so I went and I lobbied Congress, and I was amazed at what I was capable of. FCNL taught me everything I needed to know. I didn't know anything about the topic before I showed up to Spring Lobby Weekend. They gave me all the information I needed. I had a great time. I met a lot of lifelong friends. I networked with a lot of amazing people that are doing incredible things across the country, working on things that they care about. They taught me how to speak professionally. They taught me how to present myself well. They taught me how to negotiate and advocate for a position or something that I believe in. And then I actually went to an office and lobbied, and it was a life-changing event. And so after my first Spring Lobby Weekend, I went back 3 more times, my sophomore, junior, and senior year, and all 3 times I was actually leading my classmates, a total of 119 students, faculty, and staff from Wilmington College, to come to Spring Lobby Weekend because it was something I believed in so much. And it changed my life. I got so much more involved on campus. I got involved in politics in general. I was so much more informed about what's going on in the world, and I decided to be a part of it and to be a part of the change that I wanted to see happen in the world. So that was all because of Spring Lobby Weekend. It's incredible, and I think that all of you would really love it and benefit from it, and I would love to meet you and help you work on this issue. So like I said, it's March 12th through the 15th. Registration should be up on our website soon. So if you want to get in early register, that'd be awesome. I would love that. But if you want to bring a delegation from your community or your college or your meeting, I would love to help you get here. So if you are really interested in this topic, but you feel like you don't know enough, or you don't know about like finances, we have scholarships. We have so much information that I can give you, or that I can call you and talk to you about. I just really want to see you all here. So please visit our page. We have a Spring Lobby Weekend page that you can go to on our Future Advocate website. If you go to our main website, www.fcnl.org, you can go down to the bottom and look at the Young Adult Program section and click on that, and it'll take you to all of our different opportunities. And Spring Lobby Weekend is not the only young adult program that we do. We have summer internships, which are the 3 months in the summer, and they're unpaid. They are particularly good for undergraduates if you can't commit to a year-long internship, which is the program assistant Young Fellows program, which I'm a young fellow. I'm the young fellow for for young adult outreach. And we have the Advocacy Corps, which is a new program. That's a group of 17 individuals across the United States that are doing grassroots advocacy, and they are working on the issue of climate change currently, but that issue will change by year, which that's a really incredible paid opportunity, and it's incredible to see what that group has done so far. So we have that, and then we have Spring Lobby Weekend. So an excellent way to get your foot in the door if you want a internship with FCNL is to show your face at Spring Lobby Weekend and rub elbows with the people that will be potentially hiring you. So I highly recommend Spring Lobby Weekend. It's something that you can put on your resume and say that you did. I really hope that you guys have been inspired by the work that Kara's doing. I know that I am so impressed with the breadth of her knowledge. If you have questions that didn't get answered, please send them to me and I can forward them to Kara, or I can send them to the FCNL staff that is working on the issue of mass incarceration, or I can answer them myself. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that if you have the desire to bring 1 or 2 friends with you to Spring Lobby Weekend, or to bring a van full or a bus full, that you will get in touch with me. You can email me at my name, Ellen, at fcnl.org. It's really simple, just ELLEN at fcnl.org. Thank you guys so much for tuning in tonight, or watching this later. I know some of you will watch the recording later. So thank you all. Have a great night. Bye.